Well, the state of Minnesota, St. Paul, and Minneapolis have sued the Department of Homeland Security. They are seeking injunctive relief. They are trying to stop the federal government from sending more ICE troops into the cities, and trying to basically prevent the increasing chaos and escalating violence that's going on there. They have some pretty good claims. They've brought 10 counts against the federal government, Department of Homeland Security. But in order to sue the federal government, you have to sue basically officials in their official capacity. So the named defendants include Kristi Noem, Secretary of the United States Department of Homeland Security, John Condon, who is the Executive Associate Director of Homeland Security Investigations, the HSI. That's one of the investigative arms of the Department of Homeland Security. I believe they got their powers from the Treasury and the Customs Enforcement Division prior to the Homeland Security Act of 2002. Todd Lyons, who is the Acting Director of U.S. Immigration and Customs. Marcos Charles, who is the Acting Executive Associate Director for the Enforcement and Removal Operations of ICE. That's the ERO. That's the capture methodology that's ongoing in those cities, St. Paul and Minneapolis. Rodney Scott, who is the Commissioner of the U.S. Customs and Border Protection, who are also active in the cities, quite far from the border, which is interesting because the enumerated powers for the CBP is within, a reasonable distance from the border. It's typically 100 miles from the border. I believe Minneapolis and St. Paul are 200 miles from the Canadian border. And I don't think that the CBP or ICE are really going after Canadian nationals. And then, of course, Greg Bovino, who we all know is the Commander-at-Large of the United States Border Patrol. I'm not sure if that's a kind of a new position, but he's kind of like a roving commander. He's on the scene in the cities. I think he's in Minneapolis and St. Paul. He's definitely there. He's helping direct the efforts of ICE officers and agents in, capturing illegal aliens in ways that this complaint alleges include racial profiling, random stops, border-type stops miles from the border, warrantless searches and seizures, and so on. We'll get to some of that. And finally, the last defendant listed is David Easterwood, who is the acting director of the St. Paul Field Office of U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement. So these 7 defendants are listed in their official capacity and are being sued for injunctive relief, equitable relief by the state and the cities of St. Paul and Minneapolis. The complaint is 80 pages long. It's fairly voluminous. It details a lot of activity that they complain is disrupting the peace and the normal functioning of the state. Some of the things that they highlight, for example, is ICE basically commandeering public property, taking over parking lots for recreational areas and using them as staging areas for their activities, refusing to get permits from the city to do this, or at least just failing to get permits. I don't believe they've responded to letters that were written asking them to do that. They are basically creating havoc and chaos. The complaint cites that there are businesses that have revenues dropped down to COVID levels. So the impact to local businesses in parts of Minneapolis and St. Paul, where ICE is consistently active, are as low as they were in COVID, the pandemic. And Minnesota, a lot of complaints from the right, myself included. Minnesota was one of those states that really went a bit draconian with the mask mandates and, kept people inside and really kind of locked down the population, unlike, where I live. Yeah, that's pretty bad. Down to 20% of the annual revenues. Businesses are closing, at least temporarily. The employees, they claim, don't want to come to work. One of the repair facilities for the public transportation system had to close down because the tear gas that was being used so liberally by the agents nearby was coming through the ventilation system and making the work conditions completely, basically uninhabitable. The city documents that it has spent since January 8th through the filing of the complaint. So 4 days, $6 million in overtime pay for the Minneapolis Police Department due to cleaning up after ICE. The complaint details ICE capturing illegal aliens or suspected illegal aliens out of their cars and just abandoning the cars in the middle of the street. In the middle of the street, just leaving the car, blocking traffic. The police have got to come and deal with it. The complaint documents ICE agents causing traffic accidents, ramming into people. I mean, it's pretty intense. It documents warrantless searches and seizures, more than 200 miles away from the border. It documents immigration type stops that may be appropriate and probably are appropriate, or at least lawful. They're lawful at the border or within 25 miles of the border, which is where ICE enjoys pretty expanded police powers. Close to the border, it can patrol the border, and that means it can move through your private lands without your permission. Of course, agents cannot enter your dwelling without your permission, but they can search your car without permission 25 miles from the border. Minneapolis and St Paul, 200 miles from the border. So they shouldn't be doing that. But this complaint documents that they are. Now, you have to realize this is not just a bunch of left-wing paid agitators that are making these claims. This is the police department. This is the Minneapolis Police Department. If you're on the right, if you're a conservative and you support the blue line, you support the police, then these are police officers. These are state police officers. They didn't write this complaint, but the data that is being compiled into the complaint and is being alleged in these 10 different counts against these 7 defendants rely on police testimony and statistics. In fact, the complaint cites, among other interesting data, the Cato Institute's independent report from investigating arrest statistics for immigrants by ICE. Now, the Cato Institute's a right-wing institution. It's a think tank. It's definitely on the right of the spectrum. And they claim that I think it was 93% of the arrests that ICE has conducted have not detained violent criminals in any sense at all. So we hear the DHS, we hear Kristi Noem, we hear, federal officials saying that they're arresting rapists and violent criminals and terrible people that have snuck into the country, and millions of them apparently. But actually, no, they haven't. They've arrested, the 93% of the arrests have been for nonviolent criminals whose crime was entering the country illegally. But that's not the same thing as what they're claiming. Additionally, the complaint alleges just random stops, total racial profiling against the 14th Amendment. You're not allowed to discriminate on protected characteristics to enforce, your agenda, even if you have a federal mandate for, seeking out illegal immigrants. There was, troublingly, in Los Angeles last year, the Department of Homeland Security did file for a preliminary injunction to stop a case, preventing the National Guard and stuff in California. And ultimately, the Supreme Court held that the injunction could be stayed pending resolution of the appeal, basically allowing, at least for a temporary time, the use of these kind of racial profiling tactics, which is a little bit alarming because typically you don't get that kind of relief unless you have a pretty good, reasonable shot of winning the appeal. So the Supreme Court, in so doing, either, on the one hand, said that this is, needed enough that the suspension of these constitutional rights is warranted under these circumstances, or they felt that DHS had a pretty strong chance of winning on the appeal. That's not a great answer if you care about things like, equal protection under the law. And, I'm white, obviously, so it's really not my place to say. I haven't experienced racial profiling in that manner, not in this country. Places like South Africa, Zambia, Zimbabwe, absolutely, but not in the United States. So it's hard for me to weigh in on this, but my personal opinion would be that we live in a country where racial profiling should probably, not be factored in unless there is just a very, very compelling reason to do so. Of course, the counter argument is that you are more likely to be an immigrant if you don't speak English. If they hear you speaking a different language, does that generate the reasonable suspicion under the Terry versus Ohio standard, the reasonable suspicion that you may not be a legal citizen to warrant them essentially demanding proof of citizenship? Because they do have that ability in their enumerated powers. They do have the ability, if they have a reasonable suspicion that you are not a citizen, to basically ask you whether you are a citizen. And whether or not you have to answer that, you probably do. I don't know. It's a bit of a kind of complicated issue. I mean, this whole agency is being used in ways that are unique. I mean, this has not happened before. ICE was created in 2002, Homeland Security Act of 2002 after 9/11. Country was reacting, obviously. A lot of, I think, dangerous laws were passed around 2002, ostensibly to give power to the federal government to fight terrorism, right? It's when the Patriot Act came out, the thing that Edward Snowden talked about, all of the domestic surveillance, which is highly unconstitutional, violates the Fourth Amendment. All that stuff was going on, and Homeland Security Act of 2002 comes out of that time period. But not until recently, not until the Trump administration, has ICE been used in this manner, which is really pushing up against the Constitution. So there have been unlawful detention of U.S. citizens without due process, warrantless searches and seizure, according to this complaint, documented in the Twin Cities. That should trouble you. If you're a Republican, that should trouble you. If you're a Democrat, obviously that does trouble you. But if you're a Republican, that should trouble you. It wasn't so long ago that the Tea Party rose to power. Trump kind of, gets some of his ascendancy as a result of that movement, some of the Tea Party people. But the Tea Party rose to power in this country fighting big government. Well, ICE is being used in a manner to basically centralize a big government. It kind of startles and boggles my mind that some people believe that this kind of centralized federal authority that arguably violates the Constitution certainly raises many questions about the 10th Amendment, but that this sort of use of the police power, which technically speaking the federal government doesn't have in this capacity, somehow is necessary and is somehow usable to save this country, because in the use of this type of power, this country is ceasing to exist. In the use, I'm going to say it again, of this type of power, this sort of claim for general police powers to enforce a political agenda, this country is ceasing to exist as the United States of America. We do not live in the same country that I was born in. We do not live in the same country that existed 5 to 6 years ago. Things are changing really fast, and the Constitution is being stretched. It hasn't broken. Thank God for the Fourth Amendment. Thank God for the 10th Amendment. Thank God for the 14th Amendment, the 8th and the 6th Amendment, and the First Amendment. Right? These amendments protect your rights as a sovereign human being in this country to go about your business unmolested by the state. By that, I mean the federal government in this case, right? The Constitution protects both, but the state's conduct is not as much an issue here. Now, I mean, a lot of people on the right are claiming that, there are paid protesters and that the governor should be doing more and the mayor should be doing more. But, the governor and the mayor have police forces and they have police chiefs, and those guys are the people that are working overtime and are doing their very best. And most of them, I don't think, agree that ICE is simply enforcing its mandate under the Homeland Security Act of 2002. According to this complaint, Minnesota has some of the lowest illegal immigrant populations by percentage of the in the country. The national average is about 3%. Minnesota has 1.5%. Do you know which states have markedly higher percentages of illegal immigrant populations estimated in their population? Utah, Florida, Texas. You don't see 2,000 ICE agents being surged into Salt Lake City. You don't see 5,000 ICE agents being surged into Houston. You don't see 10,000 ICE agents in Miami, right? So the part of this complaint alleges, and I think there's grounds for this, there's standing, certainly. I don't think if you were to read this complaint under the, the view of the facts most favorable to the plaintiff, like you would when reading a motion to dismiss, and you are ruling on the facts in the light most favorable to the plaintiff as if they were true, then they have very, very strong standing here, because to claim with the rhetoric that is coming out of the right, which is really what's got me kind of going, you know what I mean? I was kind of happy to just sort of let things play out, but it's really the rhetoric that's coming out of the right that's kind of getting under my skin, because they're saying things that are ostensibly, provably false. And they're saying things in a way that is completely propagandized in order, which makes me not trust them. It makes me not trust that this is for the reasons that they're claiming. So Minnesota, 1.5% of its population is illegal immigrant population. By, this is not Minnesota's own statistics here. This is, national statistics. This has kind of been known for a while. Why are they targeting Minnesota? Well, because of all this fraud that they allege. But of course, it's not really ICE's place to enforce that type of fraud. ICE has the ability to arrest people for felonies that are cognizable against the United States, connected to its mandate of basically excluding and admitting immigrants, right? They have the right to arrest people for smuggling cocaine into the country. I'm not sure that daycare fraud, the billions of dollars in daycare fraud and state benefit programs, is in ICE's mandate. So if that's the reason they're there, this is the wrong force that is being deployed. Doesn't make any sense. Additionally, some of the monies, I would argue a majority of the monies that allegedly have been defrauded by these fake daycare centers, was federal money. Right? This is not just the Minnesota taxpayer that's at issue. Apparently, it's all of our money. So what is the federal government doing in just paying out this money? Right? Why don't they stop? How come it's been going on forever? According to this complaint, the fraud that is complained of was investigated back in 2017 and 18, and it was in fact brought to the federal government's attention by the states. The state was the one that brought the fraud to the federal government's attention. The state was the one who complied and helped stop this fraud. So, I mean, the complaint touches upon things that completely, and with facts and citations and data that overtly contradicts what is coming out of this administration. So the feeding our future case is the fraud that was alleged to be a pretext for ICE coming in. But according to this complaint, the fraud was already investigated, as I said, with state and federal cooperation years earlier. And I'm summarizing here. The immigration raids are, of course, not a rational means of dealing with it, since the investigation is already ongoing. It's just, the whole thing is just absolutely alarming. I mean, this doesn't even get into the fatal shooting of Renee Good, right? Or the other violent protests and counter actions that have been going on. But some of the other issues that are raised in this complaint are just absolutely egregious. Boggles the mind. It just boggles the mind. So another point that I should have raised is ICE's targeting of sensitive areas. Back in, I think it was 2012, DHS issued a memo allowing ICE and CBP to target sensitive areas, including places like hospitals, courtrooms, schools, and hospitals. Did I say hospitals and churches? And these sensitive areas are considered sensitive because there is no real help to society in targeting those areas. It basically prevents people from seeking necessary services out of fear. And it is felt in our country that the law should incentivize right conduct, including showing up for court appearances, for example, which may need to settle other disputes aside from an immigration status before you get nabbed and snatched and taken away. So I think it was in 2018, the DHS revoked that sort of policy. But then in 2020, I think it was, and I'm just doing this from memory on the fly, so forgive me if these dates are a little off. DHS issued another memo expressly allowing and arguably encouraging targeting sensitive areas. So part of the complaint that Minneapolis and St Paul have issued here or filed is the targeting of schools and the need to shut schools down because of the harassment and the fear and the danger. There was tear gas that was jettisoned at a school while the school was leaving. So you're talking kids, I think they were teenagers, but tweens maybe, but kids, school administrators, teachers, certainly not illegal aliens, sort of caught in the fray and being gassed, essentially. So a number of schools, thousands of kids, tens of thousands of kids in Minneapolis couldn't go to school for days with, knock-on consequences that created consternation for families. Where do you put these kids? What are you going to do with them? Additionally, of course, targeting hospitals. That's a terrible idea. It prevents people from seeking medical care. It prevents people from reporting diseases, that they may have. I realize that's kind of, a distant concern, perhaps, but in the post-pandemic age, in travel, international travel being something that illegal immigrants obviously are alleged to have done, perhaps even recently, preventing somebody from treating a potentially infectious disease is just negligent. Again, policy favors allowing people to go to hospital unmolested. So those sensitive areas typically have not been policed and protected. But the cost on the city and on the taxpayer of Minnesota and St. Paul and Minneapolis is quite substantial, not just from having to support these additional services, which are millions upon millions of dollars at this point, but in cleaning up the mess as well, but also in lost tax revenue from the reduced business that has resulted from ICE's occupation, essentially, of this sovereign state.